All right. So today we have another book review.
Yes.
And this is Narrative of the Life by Mr. Frederick Douglass.
Yes. It's I guess, subscripted An American Slave written by himself. It is a book about an American slave, Mr. Frederick Douglass.
Probably, undeniably, the most famous
Yes.
American slave.
Yes. I have to put a little bit of an asterisk beside written by himself. There are rumors that, I don't know if rumors is the right word, but suspicions that the story told in this book is not actually Frederick Douglass's. Did you know that, Luke?
I did not know that.
Yeah. According to some sources, some of these stories are his own, and some are those of other slaves that he met.
Okay, I've heard that before,
So,
yes.
That's a fun fact regarding the accuracy of that claim. I don't know. It's just something I've heard, and I thought it was interesting. In any case, it is an incredibly important story, which really demonstrates the monstrosity that is racism and slavery.
More than racism, yes, slavery.
Yes.
I mean, it was an institution that plagued the world for centuries.
Yes.
And the time this story takes place, from the early 1800s on towards the latter 1800s, we really see the life of Frederick Douglass, but we also see the struggle of an American slave throughout his life. Frederick Douglass is really interesting.
He is.
He was an intellectual
Yes.
that grew up in, as he says in the book, an environment that
was not very
supportive of that whatsoever.
No.
So yeah, Frederick Douglass did a lot of things in his life. He was a monolith in the abolitionist movement.
Right, yeah.
And after the war, he became really a powerhouse representing former slavery, or former slaves in the Reconstruction era. It begins, he was born, I think, is it Talbot County, Maryland?
That sounds right, yep.
Talbot County in Maryland. But he was born on a farm in Maryland.
Yeah.
And during this time, this particular area of Maryland, on these different farms in this little area, mothers were split up from their children after they were born. So Frederick Douglass's mother had him, and she was immediately separated from him.
Yeah.
And I thought it was strange. She was only taken 14 miles away.
Right.
But during that time, that's a lot bigger.
Yeah. When you have to walk that, it's a lot harder than driving it.
Yes, he really didn't have that parental figure in his life. I think one of the saddest parts of the book, for me, was how she did come and see him a few times. Mm-hmm. She kind of escaped, really.
Yeah.
And walked it at night, walked that 14-mile distance at night. And he said he remembers her, not really vividly, but in a vague sense, coming into his room and speaking to him. Mm-hmm. And then when he woke up, she was gone.
Right.
And he said this happened until he was 7 years old, until she died. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty heartbreaking, because you imagine a small child in that scenario.
It is worth noting that he said that since he never really saw his mother, he was never given the opportunity to create an attack to her.
He said the news is almost as if a stranger had died to him.
Right.
But
it's
still, the situation, looking at it from our point of view,
it's incredibly tragic.
It's incredibly tragic.
Something important to note, Mr. Frederick Douglass was not always Frederick Douglass. When he was born, he was Frederick Bailey. Mm-hmm. Then when he moved, later on in his life, he was Frederick Johnson. But he faced a certain dilemma with the last name Johnson, that there were a lot of Johnsons. Yeah. And it was hard to tell who was who when you were talking about a Johnson. So he asked a friend of his for a surname, and his friend was reading a book. I don't remember what book it was, but one of the characters' names was Douglas. So he chose to adopt the name Frederick Douglass. So that's a fun fact. So I'll be addressing him as Mr. Frederick Douglass or Mr. Douglass, but it is worth noting that at the time he was not Mr. Douglass, he was Mr. Bailey or Mr. Johnson, depending on when you're speaking about him.
Who was his master's name after he left at age 7? Because he went to the different...
Well, there's Covey, but I read this book to hear Mr. Douglass' story. Mm-hmm. I wanted to not glorify Mr. Douglass' story, but next book's important. Yeah. The slave masters who treated him awfully are objectively not important, right?
No, but there's a few. They are important to the story, though, I would argue.
Sure, but in terms of learning lessons, I think Mr. Douglass is more important. It's like publishing school shooters' names on the news. Exactly what they want.
Of course, but different masters treated him differently.
That's true.
And he learned different lessons from their experiences, different farms especially.
That's true.
Kind of to talk a little bit before we get into the main story, how the plantations are set up. You do have a master who runs the plantation.
Right.
And then you had an overseer who managed the slaves on the property. These overseers were pretty evil guys.
Right.
I think Mr. Severe was...
Yeah, he's aptly named. He's severe.
Yeah, he was probably the worst. And then there was one later on that was
better, but not, of course, being an overseer, not amazing.
Not better. They're all very evil individuals.
Right. He was less harsh, is what I should say. He was
less harsh, but Mr. Severe was...
very severe.
He was very severe, yes, and he liked to inflict pain and punishment for his own enjoyment.
Right. He did it not just to punish the slaves, but because he derived pleasure from it.
Yeah, he absolutely did. And he was so cruel to the individuals on the property that even the master scolded him.
Right.
Because he said sometimes the master would come in and see a woman whose head was cracked open, just from the brute force of his beatings. So this guy was really, really, really bad.
Yes, bad news.
And he stayed for a pretty good while, I think, right?
Yeah, he was around for a bit. And then there was the one that, I don't remember his name, because there's so many names in the story.
There's a few different overseers.
Right. I think there was 3 on his first.
Yeah.
Because there was Mr. Severe, and he was done away with for being severe.
Yeah.
And
the
then,
next one, he said, was still...
He was harsh,
but he could joke around with the
right.
slaves.
And he punished the slaves when he felt like they needed punishing, and he didn't seem to derive pleasure from it.
No. The last one, I think, was probably... I think he might be the worst.
Right.
Though he saw, he didn't gain pleasure from it, but he saw it as a righteous duty for him to inflict that punishment, and he really did.
It is worth noting that the second one was... I guess fired, for lack of a better term, from his office, because that is the term that was used in the book. I don't necessarily recognize these as official offices, but
his position on the plantation.
Yeah, it was referred to as an office at the time. He was fired from his office due to being too kind to the slaves, right? So this was the atmosphere. You could be effectively fired for having some humanity towards your fellow human.
Well, yeah, a lot of things happen like that.
Right.
In one section of the story, we see a male slave, a man who, when directly questioned, talks about his disliking of certain aspects of the plantation, and he is then sold and separated from his children and family. Mm-hmm. He was asked a question, he answered the question honestly. It wasn't malicious whatsoever. That just goes to show you the type of games that they played with these individuals. It was sad.
To loop back to the story, we had the main character, Frederick. He was around 7 years old at the time, at the beginning of the book. And it's worth noting that they don't actually, the majority of the slaves on the plantation don't actually know how old they are or when they were born.
Yeah.
They can only estimate how old they were. And Frederick estimates himself to be around 7 years old at the time. And he's like any other slave boy, doesn't have any freedom, works hard, giving a very small ration of food and clothing.
Yeah.
They called it an allowance.
I think they get 2 shirts a year and 2 pants and a jacket. And in the book, it describes it as coarse clothing. Right. It was all very, very tough.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't anything that would last a full year.
No.
And they just had to make do. And they were always given very little food. And they kind of just learned to deal with it. And Frederick progresses like this for a few years. He gets older. He maybe gets a bit stronger just as he's growing as a boy. And eventually, he's moved to Baltimore.
Yeah.
Baltimore, Maryland.
Which is a major part of the book.
Right.
To kind of look back, when you said he didn't know how old he was.
Right.
He said all the slaves were really jealous of the white children because they always knew
how old they were.
And he said that was always something that he wondered. He said he could kind of gauge it from comments made by his masters, but he never really knew for sure.
It's also worth noting that there was suspicion that his master was his
His
father.
father, yes.
Right. Because, of course, and we'll try to keep it PG-13 for the podcast, but the masters abused their slaves in more ways than one.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of children slaves that came out of it. And according to the law at the time, the children were the property of the masters as well.
They called them the slave codes, and they could really do anything they wanted to.
Yeah.
Murder wasn't prosecuted.
Right.
Rape wasn't prosecuted. At that time, it didn't really matter.
And part of the reason for that was a black individual could not testify in court.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, if you murdered a slave and only black individuals were around, well, none of them could testify against you. Nothing's going to happen to you, right?
No.
So, there's a lot of atrocities committed in the book.
Multiple murders, and most of them or all of them are really vile.
Yeah.
Another aspect of it that I forgot to mention earlier is age 7, they enter the fields.
Right.
They go to work outside.
And
he says
that's why he starts the book at age 7.
Yeah, because before that he was almost separated. The older slave women who couldn't work in the fields took care of the younger children, and it was still really bad. But it was almost a safe haven for him.
Yeah.
In that little area of the plantation. At age 7, he was sent to the fields, and there he really started to witness the true atrocities of what was taking place.
There were frequent whippings for very small infractions.
For anything, really.
Anything,
And
yeah.
they would tie their hands up, and they would raise them up to where their tippy toes were standing just off the ground. And they would whip them, and they said that they would whip on the back where the blood was flowing the most, which is just really
Horrifying. And Luke said for the smallest things, and that's not even necessarily true, they would whip them for nothing at all, just to show them that they could, and to put fear into them, which is awful. But Mr. Douglass is on this first plantation for a few years, and he eventually gets moved to Baltimore, Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And he's with a pretty well-off family. And initially, his experience is very different. And it's different throughout the whole time, but it's markedly different for the first 2 months.
Well, he says a slave in the city is
Almost
almost compared to a free man compared to what a slave that lives on a plantation experiences.
Right.
But he loved the woman master up there.
Right. And the woman master had never owned a slave before, and she was always very kind to him. Granted, there was still that dynamic where he was property, he was owned, but she treated him with more compassion than anyone else had at that point. And she even began to teach him the ABC, or what we know as the alphabet. He is called the ABC in the book, and he was going to learn to read. But her husband quickly put a stop to that and said that if she was to do that, he, as in being Douglass, would eventually learn to think for himself and would learn to hate being a slave. And he instructed his wife to stop teaching Frederick the ABCs at once.
And then she became
very harsh
and cruel towards him. And he says that almost made it even worse because he saw how well he could be treated. And then the opposite.
It was taken away.
Yeah.
And Frederick Douglass was reflecting on this later on in life, and he said that the slave master was right. Once he was learning to think for himself and learning to read, he began to despise slavery even more, knowing that he would never have the opportunity to become a free man because he was a slave.
And when he was in Baltimore at this house, that's when he first heard the abolition movement.
Right.
He didn't know what the word meant, but he thought the context in which the white people mentioned it was very interesting.
Right.
So he knew it had something to do with slavery and being free, but he didn't know exactly what path it would take. Right.
And like we mentioned, the instruction of the alphabet stopped for Douglass, and that frustrated him. So he sought out ways to continue learning the ABCs, and that primarily was by asking white children that he would interact with on the street. He would learn one thing here, another thing there, and eventually, over the time, he learned the ABCs and he learned to read. Through learning to read, he began to expand his knowledge and read newspapers, which was a huge source of information for him.
Yeah.
And I kind of miss that nowadays. I feel like newspapers are important, but having access to a newspaper could really change your world.
Yeah, and during this book, it really illustrates the importance of being literate
Right.
And of having access to that stuff. I think a lot of people take it for granted nowadays.
Right. I think
he didn't have that same freedoms that we do.
I think as much as this book is about slavery, it's also about freedom of information, because that freedom to consume information was taken away
It's
from
about
him.
the freedom of the benefits of being free.
Right.
And all that comes with that. Yeah, he didn't have access to that stuff before, and then he gained that new skill and really opened himself up to a much broader world, and that allowed him to do all the things he did later in the story.
It's worth noting that his masters were very apprehensive of him even being in possession of a book, because they were once again worried that he was going to start thinking for himself. And I mean, they were right. He was starting to think for himself. But of course, that was a very positive thing for Frederick and a very negative thing for his masters, because he was beginning to become apprehensive towards them and despise them, really.
Yeah.
Understandably so. But he really took advantage of this opportunity to learn, and he made the most out of it. He noted that, I think it was Monday nights, his masters would be out of the house, and he would have the opportunity to read, so he took advantage of it. And he learned a lot, and without that opportunity to learn to read, I don't like using the word opportunity here, because there's very little opportunity, but without his hard work, I think.
Well, he had to create it for himself.
Right. Without his dedication to expanding his mind, he would not have ended up where he did. Anyways, so he spends some time in Baltimore, but some things happen. Masters die. He gets traded around a little bit. Nothing is really too noteworthy, except for when he returns back to the farm. And he is under a new overseer, new master, and this one's cool.
Yeah.
And he says for the first 6 months, he was sent there because in his new life of more freedom and more rights in Baltimore, his new slave owners back on the plantation were weary of him being too independent or too unruly. So they sent him to a slave breaker, Mr. Covey. And Mr. Covey was known for breaking slave spirits, taking a slave and just beating him into submission. And he was successful for the first 6 months with Frederick. But after the first 6 months, he was with him for about a year. Frederick kind of fought Covey back one time and gained, I don't want to say respect, but a little bit of, he gained the ability to defend himself, and Covey began to fear him slightly. But I'll give some background about what happened. Mr. Douglass was working on the farm one day. Mr. Covey told him to fetch some lumber from a forest using some ox. And Mr. Douglass had never used or driven ox before. And he ended up tipping the cart, and the ox ran off. And that was pretty chaotic. And he noted that he nearly died twice. He was almost crushed twice. So he reports back to Mr. Covey and tells him what happened, and he's just beat and beat and beat. Douglass has enough. He runs off back to his old master and says, "Mr. Covey's going to kill me. Like, you can't make me stay here." And his old master's like, "Yes, I can. I'll let you stay here tonight. But you gotta go back in the morning." So Douglass goes back in the morning, and he kind of hides and tries to sneak back in. But on the way back, he meets a fellow slave who was on his way to see his wife, because his wife was free. And the fellow slave says that if you carry the special type of root in your right pocket, it'll protect you from ever being whipped again. And Douglass is like, "What? No, this is voodoo. This won't work." But he takes the root, he puts it in his pocket, and he confronts Covey. And Covey comes to strike him, to punish him for seemingly running away. And Douglass just fights back. And he beats Covey, kind of reverse of what usually happens. And Douglass says, and this is about 6 months after Douglass originally arrived to this plantation, Douglass states that for the next 6 months, he was never whipped again. And for the rest of his life, he was never whipped again. He'd been beat up plenty of times. He'd gotten in plenty of altercations and fights. but he was never whipped. And Douglass later remarks that he thinks that the reason Covey didn't do anything like shoot him or just beat him to death was because it would have hurt Covey's reputation as a slave breaker.
Yeah.
If he would have had to kill a slave, it would have totally rebuked his reputation. Covey kind of figured out that it was better to have a bruised ego and a lot of money than kill a slave and lose your business.
Yeah. The farm at this time, too, the farm was almost a coveted spot for the slaves. And as bad as it was, they said it was a lot better than other plantations around. They even had different songs about getting sent to the farm, as they called it.
And sometimes they would meet up with other plantations, and they would each plantation would brag about how awesome their respective plantation was, or their respective master was, and that's just mind blowing to me. Like, point blank, period. It's not.
And you got to think
awesome.
about the mindset too.
And I realize why they say this, but the fact that they're living in these awful conditions and they think it's amazing is heartbreaking.
But they also said if word gets back to the slave owners that they said anything negative about them, they would be gone.
Right?
Yeah. So they said any slave that was asked would pretty much always say how happy they were and how good they were treated, even though that's not the case. And they knew that they weren't treated well, but they did live in a constant state of fear.
Yeah. Mr. Douglass is at this current plantation for about a year, and finally he's moved to another plantation. He had spent his term at the slave breakers, and he was moved back to Baltimore in order to learn a trade, and that was caulking. And I'm not exactly totally sure what that is, to be totally honest. It reminded me of caulking.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I heard it.
But I'm not totally sure.
Caulking, well, let me look it up.
So, we looked it up, and it seems to be an alternate spelling of caulking, which, duh.
Considering the time period, too, it probably is the same thing.
Right. He learned to caulk on boats, specifically, and he worked for a master for, I want to say, 6 years. He kind of gained some more independence and ability to think for himself while in Baltimore once again. And he was, just to give some information, this master was building a boat for, I want to say, Mexico? For the country of Mexico. And they had a very short turnaround time for the boat. They had to get it done. They had to get it out. So they didn't really have time for anyone to sit down and learn a trade, like, from zero. So they just gave him a caulk gun, I guess, and told him to get to work. And he was the errand boy a lot, too. He would go get boards, go get nails, go get whiskey, whatever, right? And eventually, over time, he learned, and he got pretty good at caulking. So he would eventually go and do his own caulking jobs. He would operate independently of his master, and he would come back to his master and pay his master all of his wages, and his master would give him back 5 cents.
Again, he's becoming more and more independent.
Right. And you may think, oh, he's getting paid now. No, he would make $7, $8 a week, and then his master would give him 5 cents. That's a slap in the face. That's an insult, right? It was not a good arrangement. So Frederick approached master and was like, hey, this is not fair. Give me independence. Let me keep my money. The master's like, okay. Well, you can buy your own tools. You can find your own clients. You can do your own work. And then you can still give me all your money, but I'll give you a little bit more money back. Frederick was like, okay, deal. So that went on for a few weeks, and Frederick said that over time he would get more and more money back at the end of each week. One day he had went to a camp of some sorts, and he got back a day late, and he paid his master a day late, and his master was furious. He thought that Frederick had run away and had taken away any and all freedom that Frederick had, quote-unquote, earned over that period of time.
Yeah.
That was very frustrating for Douglass, and that was kind of the last straw, really. So Frederick moves around a little bit more, and he ends up creating this Sunday school group with a group of fellow slaves where he would teach them, because at this time, Frederick can read pretty fluently.
Yeah,
really.
And at the Sunday school, he starts teaching the
other slaves how to
read.
And they did it under the pretense of, we're teaching slaves to read the Word of God.
Yeah.
And other masters were more okay with that than others. Some were like, no, No. Other masters were like, okay, well, it's the Bible, right?
It was very smart on his part how he did it.
Right. To Frederick's credit, he did teach them how to read so that they could read the Bible.
Yeah.
They were also learning how to read so that they could read abolitionist material, newspapers, books. He was trying to get them to think, and he succeeded,
Yeah.
to his credit. And over time, they developed a strategy to run and escape from slavery. And it was the night before they were going to leave, and someone chickened out and talked. A bunch of slave owners burst into the... They had even created fake notes. They had forged notes in their master's handwriting to show to anyone who would try to stop them, giving them permission to travel. I think it was upstate Maryland, somewhere, just close enough to a free state. It was the night before they were left, and a bunch of slave masters break in. It was very abrupt, and Mr. Douglass was terrified that they would find the notes that they had written. There was a lot of fighting and brawling, and I don't believe any gun was actually shot, but they were pointed. A lot of them were pointed. In the middle of all this, Douglass had the foresight to take the notes that they had written and throw them in the fire. But there was one issue. They had already given some of the notes to the other slaves, and they were on their bodies. So they had to attempt to get them off of their bodies so that obviously they were going to be stripped naked and searched. They were given a little bit of bread because they were going to be drugged to the county jail the next day. Drugged by chain off the back of a horse or carriage or whatever. They're given the bread, and I mention that because Douglass went to all the slaves and said, "Eat the paper with your bread." So they swallowed the paper.
Yeah.
Which is, if you can just imagine that, that's...
Well, the situation was an extreme situation.
It was dire.
They had to do it.
They had to do it, but just the fact...
It's
once
hard,
again,
it is hard to imagine.
Looping back to the fact that they had to do this, it's all just incredibly heartbreaking. Anyways, they end up at the county jail. They escape. He ends up making his way up to New York.
And New York at this time was a haven for runaway slaves.
Right.
This is before the runaway slave, the Fugitive Slave Act, I'm thinking, right?
I'm not sure.
I think it was, because once he made it to New York, for a while there, he was pretty secure.
Right, but he was still nervous that, because of course slave masters would pay bounty hunters to go and find the slaves and bring them back so that they could be killed and made an example of. Douglass was, in reality, probably fairly safe, but he was still much too anxious for this. But he met abolitionists along the way, and they told him to get to Philadelphia, that it was much safer. So he contacted his soon-to-be wife. He'd met a woman throughout his travels, and he asked her to marry him. They got married, and then they traveled to Philadelphia. And a very kind abolitionist gave him money in order to pay the fee to travel from New York to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And it actually ended up not being enough. So I guess it was carriage person, I don't know what the correct term is, took the money, and then he took all their possessions because they didn't have enough money and they had already arrived. So they arrived to Philadelphia with nothing, but they asked around, because they were given a name, and they were told to find this person. They asked around, and they eventually met up with the abolitionist, and they got back on their feet, and they started working.
Philadelphia in Pennsylvania at this time, if you look back at its history, it has old Quaker roots.
Right.
And Quakers were known to be
very kind
people. And that area was very prone to the abolitionist movement.
Right.
So it just makes sense that
Yeah.
Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, for that matter, was a haven for runaway slaves.
Granted, the book does not mention Quakers in specific.
No, but
the culture permeated.
Yes, the culture, and you can use historical context to overlay it onto the story.
Right.
But yeah, in Philadelphia, that's where they really got most of their connections and start with the abolitionist movement, which is really neat to see.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a rundown of the book. I have some things I would like to say about kind of some thoughts that Douglass had, because the book is very chronological, but he does throw in just paragraphs of observations that aren't necessarily in any chronological order. The first one I would like to mention, which I thought was very interesting, was his criticism of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was basically a network of abolitionists within the southern states who would help runaway slaves and help them to reach...
Or transport them above the Mason-Dixon line and even into Canada.
Right.
And especially once the Civil War started.
Right.
To get them across Union lines.
Mm-hmm.
Another famous slave that is known for the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman.
Right.
But yeah, the Underground Railroad helped thousands and thousands of slaves escape to freedom.
And that's why I was very surprised to hear Frederick Douglass criticize it.
Yeah.
He called it the Upperground Railroad, and he said that it was much too obvious. And I was like, well, okay, maybe for your circumstances.
But the system was complex, too.
Right, it was.
How they transported them.
And they had secret signs on each houses that would designate which house was safe and what house was the safe house within the area. It was very intricate. It was honestly very impressive.
Very dangerous, too.
Very dangerous.
For those
Everyone
who traveled
involved.
on it, and especially for those who were helping run the Underground Railroad.
Right.
If they were caught, especially if they were white,
They'd be murdered.
they'd be killed. The
Yeah.
punishment would be extreme.
Right.
But yeah, I thought that was interesting, too, how he kind of hit back
criticized
at
it.
the Underground Railroad.
And throughout the book, he's very critical of some types of religion. And he actually adds an appendix to the... I thought that was straight. It's titled as an appendix, but it's not really much of an appendix. And at the end of the book, he adds an appendix stating that what he hated was the religion of the slave owners, the hypocrisy. He said that these slave owners would preach being faithful and loyal to their wives, and then they would abuse their slaves.
Yeah.
Or they would preach being kind and act loving each other, and then they would abuse their slaves. Or they would preach how every man was created equal.
And then they'd abuse their slaves.
They'd abuse their slaves.
And even the masters, we discussed this earlier, had children with the slaves.
Right.
And they enslaved their own sons. Or
Right.
they had, their own brothers beat their own brothers.
Right.
So yeah, it went against biblical values, that the same ones that they were claiming to
Uphold. Yeah.
Very hypocritical.
And Douglass mentions this, and he says, well, it may seem that I have negative feelings towards religion or Christianity. He says, I do towards some sorts, but not towards what I believe to be the true Christianity. And he believed the true Christianity to be the Christianity that promoted loving people, helping people, treating each other with dignity, following what was actually biblical and not twisting it to beat people. And I would agree. I think love people, right?
Yeah, but his thoughts on everything was very interesting.
Yes.
And it wasn't just a straight narrative, too.
Right.
He also broke down his own personal thoughts, like you stated.
Right. It was an excellent read. I am so happy that we decided to read this. This is probably one of the more influential books, one of the more important books that we've read.
Absolutely. And his story doesn't just end there.
No, it doesn't.
I listened to an audiobook for this one. Because it's easier for me for certain circumstances during this time. But the version I listened to had a... Did yours have a really long introduction to it?
Mine did. I didn't end up reading it.
Okay. I did. It gave a lot of historical context to continue that story. His time in Great Britain was extremely influential on Mr. Douglass. Because they freed their slaves, I think, 1833.
Okay.
So by the time he made it over there, they were all free men. And he got to study with different people and see how also it should be like.
Right.
How attitudes in Europe was much different. And when he came back to the States, he really carried a lot of the things he learned over there back home with him. But his life goes on. I think he died in the 1880s. Had a really long lifespan, and he got to see a lot of his life after the narrative ends.
Yeah.
In this story. But yeah, the Frederick story goes on. It's a very important story, and a story like this is extremely important, not only to recognize the history of what happened, because we all need to learn what happened. It was a dark stain upon not only the history of America, but the world too. But it also makes me and you and every other student who reads it more thankful for what we have.
It
To
does,
the opportunity. You know, we got taught at age 5 and 6 to read, and anything we wanted to learn or know, we had access to.
Right.
Not everybody had that, and today we take that for granted. We really do.
And looping back to what you said, presenting it in a way that garners the correct response from the reader. I was reading this, and one of my friends in my pre-calculus class noticed that I was reading it, and he had heard of it, and he'd heard of our English teacher talk about it, actually. And he was like, oh, that looks interesting. And he asked if he could take a look at it. And to his own credit, he admits that he does not like to read, and that he does not read. But he was reading this in class today, and he was enjoying it. And I thought that was amazing, that just a simple narrative of a life can draw someone's attention so much, especially someone who doesn't like to read. I just think the book's special.
I think books like this are actually, yes, like you said, are special. Fiction is engaging, but I think people also can have a disconnect with fiction.
Right. But this
is true, and you really get to see a struggle of a man.
Yeah.
And his fight for freedom and for the freedom of others. So this is a true story, and it's extremely powerful, and I recommend it to everybody.
Right.
I think everybody should.
Something interesting in my edition is in the back, after the narrative ends, there are refutations written by various figures at the time. So some of his former slave owners, some associates of Mr. Covey, some people that he met in Maryland. They actively tried to campaign against the authenticity and the reputability of this book. They would say that it was filled with lies, that it was inaccurate, that blah, 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 blah. And they would publish these to try to discredit Mr. Douglass.
The validity of the book.
Right. And I thought that it was incredibly powerful that the publisher chose to include these letters in the book. I thought that was really neat. I read through a few of them, and they're nasty. They're full of hate and vitriol. But I just thought it was amazing that the publisher included it. This is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. It's a pretty short read, 75 pages is my edition.
Yeah, it can be really easily digestible.
Right. I read it all in a day. I didn't read the introduction. I tend to skip introductions.
I always read introductions. I think they're important.
Yeah, I think they're important.
It kind of gives you more context to the book and
I agree.
why it was written.
But yeah, good book.
Go read it.
Go read it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank y'all.